Welcome to Get Real, How to Live a More Authentic Life, with psychologist and author of over 75 books, Dr. Barry Weinhold. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Get Real, How to Live a More Authentic Life with your host, Dr. Barry Weinhold. Hello, Dr. Barry. How are you today?
I'm grateful to be alive.
Same. Wonderful, as always. Great sentiment to start the show. What's new with you?
Well, just a lot of got some fishing in and caught some fish and had a chance to get in the mountains at a most beautiful place I've ever found to fish. This mountain lake at about 9,000 feet. And
oh, wow.
It's always stocked, always catch fish. But even if I don't catch fish, just being out there in that environment is healing. How about you? What are you doing new?
Not too much. This is the last episode that you'll see with this background. I will be redecorating soon. So getting some new furniture and whatnot in the office. So
I'll be anxious to see what that looks like.
Yeah, me too, honestly. But yeah, that's what I got going on this week. How do you create all of the things that you use in therapy with your clients? We talk a lot about the stuff that you do here, but how do you create all of these things?
I try it on myself. I don't use anything with anybody else, or I don't tell anybody anything else that I haven't found to work for me. Like we talked about the addiction to adrenaline last time in the last episode. I've worked on my own addiction to adrenaline. We've talked about taming demons. I've worked on taming my own demons. I mean, and first of all, identifying my demons and looking at them. And I'm still in that process. I still occasionally go into therapy to see if there are any other demons that I missed. Because, and this therapist is also an expert on dreams. And so he says, bring me a dream and I might be able to find a demon in it. So I'm kind of on that path. And that's why I can do what I do, is because I have found things through my own therapy, my own research, even my own practice. I mean, I learn as much as my clients do often in my sessions. And it's really interesting because there's a phenomenon that happens. I'm sure any therapist will identify with this, that any issue you're currently working on personally will show up in your clients.
Yeah.
They'll walk in the door with that issue. And I don't know why that happens, but it does. And so then you're caught with, okay, how do I keep my issue out of this? Usually I just admit it. What you got, I have some too, and I've been working on it. I'll show you what I've learned that works, and that's all I can do.
I like it. I enjoy that approach and that honesty.
Yeah.
Awesome. So what did all of what else sort of did you have any specific researches that you've done?
Yeah, right. Well, actually, after doing a lot of my own work, and then as I was seeing clients, I had this very strange thing happen over and over with a number of clients. I'd have clients who came with all the symptoms of childhood trauma. I mean, their lives just were not working, and it was pretty clear that it was the way they grew up that caused that. And yet, I'd say, well, now what happened that would have been causing this in your childhood? And they would usually say, nothing happened. I had a very happy childhood. And I thought, now this is really weird. How can you have these crazy things going on in your life that are disrupting your life, and you had such a wonderful, happy childhood? Well, what I've discovered after more and more of these people came in, and I thought more and more about it, that the cause or the events that are causing their current problems are not events. It's what didn't happen that's causing them. It's the neglect, not the abuse. And so that one was a real eye-opener for me. Then I began researching neglect, which is much harder to identify because nothing happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, even people who have abuse usually remember the abusive incidents. The time when my mother slapped me, or the time my father raped me, or they have a distinct memory of the abuse. But when it comes to neglect, they couldn't remember anything. So that was the biggest challenge to try to deal with and help people connect the dots with things that didn't happen. And that was much more challenging than anything I'd ever done before. And so it required a lot more personal research. I looked at what were the neglects in my family. What did I neglect getting? Like, for example, and I did something about this, but I realized that nobody ever in my family growing up ever told me that they loved me. It just was not spoken. And also, hardly ever did I ever get a hug from anybody in my family. They just were not huggers. And I looked at what effect is that having on my life? And I saw that it had some very severe effects on how I felt about myself. I didn't know how lovable, if I was really lovable, or was I just making that up? I mean, it's nice to hear that from other people. So I took it upon myself to start, whenever I'd had a phone call with my parents, I was living at different states at the time, to end the call with, well, I just want you to know I love you. And finally, after a long time of keeping it up, they got it. And they kept, now would say it even before I would initiate it. And then one time my dad was at a workshop I did, and he stood up and pointed his finger at everybody and said, I want everyone to know how important it is to tell your children that you love them, and sat down. So he got it. But I had to take some action. I had to do something that filled the gap. And so that was not abuse, that was neglect. And that's what I'm talking about here, is neglect. So in working with clients, I mean, I came up with a term that now has become a buzzword in the profession called developmental trauma, which means childhood trauma. It's a name for it. Besser van der Kolk and others have used that term, but I was the first to use that term in the literature. And I don't care that other people took my term and used it. I was hopeful they would, but because I think it gave a name for what we're talking about here. And people sometimes need that name in order to identify what we're really talking about here. And so then for a while I was writing about all this, but there was no research out there to support it. I had to just have my clinical experience that I could point to and say, well, I know it works because here's how what's happened to my clients as a result of working on their neglect issues. So, but luckily in 1997, the first big research study was done on not necessarily this topic, but it was actually the long-term effects of childhood or developmental trauma on people's health, not just mental health, but physical health. It was called the ACE study. And for now, often when I meet one of my colleagues, I say, well, what's your ACE score? Some of them don't even know what I'm talking about. I mean, that's how this is still yet a mystery, and even in our profession. but people who are tuned in to the ACE research know that it really put a solid research base underneath the whole idea that whatever happens to us, what I've been saying earlier, whatever happens to us is stored in our body, and long term it starts to affect our body. And so the whole ACE research, it started in San Diego with a man from Robert Amdahl, I believe his name is, from the Centers for Disease Control, and another guy from Kaiser Permanente teamed up to design this massive research study. They had a perfect audience. They had an outpatient clinic in San Diego, which was run by Kaiser Permanente. And so everybody who came to the clinic got to take this 10-question questionnaire. Put that up on the screen. I'll show it. We'll talk about it. This is called the ACE questionnaire. And it says, ask people, and this is what they asked every patient who came to the clinic had to fill this out. And it became part of their patient records. So when a physician saw them, they would have this data in front of them about how they filled this out and could ask them more questions about it. But basically, these are 10 questions they came up with that determined they were looking at people who had, and you had to answer yes or no on any of these 10. If you answered yes on 4 or more, they counted that as people who were had trauma in their background of some kind. And they compared them against people who had, when they answered this questionnaire, they didn't have any. They couldn't find any yeses on their inventory. And it was about 62% had more than one or more, and about 30-some% didn't have any. So they had two groups to compare. Then they looked at the long-term health history of each one of these. They had all the records, they had all the health records. So they could look at how many of them had heart disease, how many of them had diabetes, how many of them had cancer, how many of them had alcoholism, or how many were depressed, how many, and so they asked all these questions and compared how many in each of the categories, each of the two groups had these diseases. With the group that didn't have any, there was a far less of any of these diseases, far fewer. And so they found, for example, that people who had 4 or more ACE yeses on the ACE questionnaire had 2.5 times, were 2.5 more likely to have heart disease than people who didn't have any. I mean, that in itself was an amazing statistic to find that out. And so the whole ACE questionnaire provided the information. I'll talk more about the results in a few minutes, but I just want to talk a little bit more about the instruments that here. Now, when I read the ACE questionnaire, I said, from my research, they didn't count neglect enough. There's only 2 questions on here that even remotely relate to neglect. The rest of them are about abuse and other kinds of things. So I thought that's not a good representation of what from my research of what neglect, how important neglect is. So I designed a separate questionnaire called the Adverse Childhood Experience Neglect Inventory. Adverse Childhood Neglect Inventory. There it is. And basically, I asked people again, as they did before your 18th birthday, did any of these things not happen? Rather than happen. Well, it actually is happening, because if you look at the items, you see that the items is like, were you a playpen baby? Or was your, I'm trying to read them. As a child, did you feel your parents didn't understand your needs? Yes or no? And if they marked yes, then I counted the number of yeses they had. Now, I had no national data to go against, but I assumed that if somebody had a yes on, there are 40 items on here, there are only 10 on the other one. So if they had 4 times 4, which would be 16, they would probably be in that same category of people who had adverse effect of long-term adverse effect from neglect. So I'm doing ongoing research on this. So if you in the members of the audience want to download it and take it and give me any feedback on that, I'd be useful. And I use this with my clients a lot. And so I don't. I will ask them about each of the yeses, and then they give me more details about them. And then we talk about those 4 steps about taming the demons that we talked about earlier in the other episodes. But then the other factor that they didn't talk about in the ACE research was resiliency. Why do some people not have any? Maybe they had some things that happened, but something intervene to heal that or to complete the learning from that. And so it wasn't an unfinished business. It wasn't a trauma, which is what I call trauma, as unfinished business. And so I then said, well, we need a resiliency inventory to see if what other factors might have influenced the way they answered this. So I borrowed one from a couple of colleagues that developed an ACE research resiliency questionnaire. Again, it's 14 items, but again, I don't have, and I don't think they do either, have any national research base to compare about this. But it certainly is a factor that if any of these, I believe that my father loved me when I was little. Now that is a research shows that forms some resiliency. I believe that my mother loved me when I was little. Even if it wasn't true, if they believed it, it's important. Or my family, neighbors, and friends talked often about making our lives better. Did you have neighbor, family, and community support for having a healthy childhood? I mean, these are all things that the research has shown are things that make people more resilient. Why does one person in a family where all craziness is happening turn out fine and the other one not? It's resiliency. And so that's what I was also asking people to, and you can certainly download that and take it and see what resiliency factors were involved in the kinds of things that happened that might have made whatever happened not as a traumatic event. Maybe it just became an owie. The difference between a traumatic event and owie usually is that if someone was there to comfort you when you had something happen to you that was disturbing, it just becomes an owie and doesn't become a trauma. And owies are easily healed. Traumas have long-lasting effects, as this research showed. So let's go to the research results and briefly share what the study really talked about. So this was the experiences, the largest study of its kind ever done to examine the long-term health and social effects of adverse childhood experiences over the lifespan. And so their conclusions, experiences while growing up that deeply affect a young person and profoundly affect the emotional and physical health later in life. That was what they found. And these are the 10 items. There was 3 on abuse, 2 on neglect, and then 5 on household dysfunction, like was there mental illness in their family? Was the mother treated violently by the father in your presence? Was there divorce? Was there substance abuse? Was somebody in the family incarcerated? As well as was there physical or emotional neglect, and then physical, emotional, and sexual abuse? Those were the 10 items from the study. Next slide. So when they looked at the effects of all these things, they saw that, and this is their fact sheet, they saw that these adverse childhood experiences had long-term effects on addictions, depression, anxiety, PTSD, autoimmune disease, chronic illness, fractures, you name it. You go down the list, and all the research, again, comparing the 2 groups, the groups that didn't have any adverse childhood experience because compared to people who had 4 or more out of 10. Next one. So here's the study in itself, the first study. these 17,337 adults were, 64% had one or more. I was a little off on my percentages there. And so they found the strong link between the ACE score and adult and onset of chronic illnesses such as HVD, multiple dystrophy, hepatitis, chronic lung diseases, depression, suicide, etc. And then they found, this was interesting, people who had 6 or more ACEs died earlier, nearly 20 years earlier on the average than those who didn't have any. The average for those with 6 or more was 60.6 years versus 79.1 for those that didn't have any. So this is actually a public health issue. Here is the prevalence on all of the items, all the 10 items. They found that 7% had incarcerated parents or family members. There was sexual abuse in 10%, drug problems in 10, and so on, down to verbal abuse was the highest one, which you would probably guess that might be one of the highest ones. And then again, here, those who, the comparison of probability of outcomes given 100 American adults. So out of 100, 33 had no ACEs, and they had 1 in 16 smokes, 1 in 69 are alcoholic, and so on. So with 7 or more, 1 in 6 smokes. I mean, 4 or more. 1 in 6 smokes. 1 in 6 were alcoholics. 1 in 30 were IV drug users. 1 in 6 had heart disease, and 1 in 5 had attempted suicide. So completely showing how the long-term effects of these early childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences, had on people and their lives. Next one. So here's how it sized up for depression. Those who had 4 or more, looks like 68% of the women had depression versus those who had none. It was like 16 or 18% of the women. So a huge difference in terms of chronic depression in adults. Next one. Suicide attempts. Again, those who had no adverse childhood experiences, very, very low, like less than 2%. And with those who had 4 or more, it's almost 20%. Huge differences in long-term effects. And then the lifetime, this is a slide that shows kind of many of the lifetime effects of the ACEs. They found these in their research. Critical and essential sensitive developmental periods and adverse experiences caused changes in brain development, electrical, chemical, and cellular mass changes in the brain development. And it causes the hardwiring of the brain to change. And then they talked about chronic disease, psychiatric disorders, impaired cognition, work, school problems, obesity, alcohol use, risky sex, crime, poverty, and intergenerational transmission of these kind of dysfunctional behaviors. So huge kind of validation about how these early adverse childhood experiences affected the whole lifespan of people. And then resilience was a big one, as I mentioned that. So there's again looking at what are the factors involved in resilience. So the stressors are on the one side, and the good things or the resources that create resiliency are on the other side. So not being able to pay bills, having people you can count on as a resilient factor, a doctor you can trust, having enough money. You can see how these can create resiliency against mitigating against the long-term effects of these diseases. And then the last thing, gone down there under genetics, it also really does change our DNA. The research now shows that very few of our DNA molecules, our nerve endings, are activated. Some of them are only activated by experience. So it really showed to me that I was on the right track all along. And these studies validated the fact that early childhood experiences, connecting the dots to those, can save your life and certainly make you happier and lead more productive and less more stress-free lives.
Well, that was fascinating.
Yeah. So ask people what their ACE score is and see what you get.
Yeah. I think 1 or 2 for me.
Yeah.
I took it during that.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a 1 or 2.
Mine was higher.
Yeah.
But I've had resiliency factors that have mitigated against the long-term effects.
I wasn't able to. I didn't take yours during it because the other one was only 10 questions. So I didn't take the adverse childhood
Neglect one. Yeah.
This one, yeah, the
Yeah,
more in-depth one. But the ACE was 1 to 2. I think that it probably would be more on the other one, a little bit higher because some of the really bad things I was fortunate to avoid. But this is fascinating, and not enough people talk about it's wonderful that so many people are now talking about the mental health effects of childhood trauma, but no one still talks about the physical effects. So this is a fantastic study, and thank you.
Yeah, really. I mean, this really brought it down to the reality of how your physical health is affected by this, which before all that people talked about was, well, it might affect your mental health. But this is clearly about both mental and physical health.
Absolutely. Well, all of these resources, all of these questionnaires, the inventories, the slide deck, all of that stuff is located in the show notes. Just click it and it will bring you to the Google Drive folder, and you can download and take all of these assessments for yourself, and use all of these resources because that's why we're here, right? So thank you, Dr. Weinhold. Is there anything else you want to say before we go today?
No, I think we've gone long enough on this one.
Well, I appreciate it. And like I said, you can check out the show notes for all of that information, and you can go to circle.org for anything else that you want to know about Dr. Barry Weinhold. Dr. Barry, thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Good working with you, Ben.
You too.
Next time. Right. Bye.
For more information, please visit the Colorado Institute for Conflict Resolution and Creative Leadership at CICRCL.org or click the link in the show notes.